if you have a smartphone in your pocket right now, or if you're listening to us on a screen, you are actually an active participant in what might be the most exhausting, large-scale psychological experiment in human history.
Yeah, absolutely. And we aren't just talking about, needing a little less screen time.
Right. Not just a digital detox.
Exactly. This is a fundamental, staggering rewiring of the human soul. We're witnessing a complete shift.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into a really dense stack of sources. We've got sociology, clinical psychology, and some incredibly profound ancient theology.
The goal is to really understand the sheer, unyielding exhaustion of what we call the curated self.
Yeah, and more importantly, we're going to explore a radical ancient antidote to this modern disease, which our sources refer to as the gospel cure.
Because the stakes here are, frankly, existential. We're living through this era of unprecedented identity fragmentation.
It's way beyond just, putting your phone down during dinner.
Oh, totally. What we're witnessing across global digital culture is a fundamental anthropological shift. It's a complete recalibration of how human beings construct and maintain the core of who they are.
So you as a listener are basically being pressured to build your identity in a completely different way than any generation before you.
Which is incredibly heavy when you really think about it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really grasp the spiritual and psychological exhaustion of our digital lives, we actually need to hit pause and look backward.
Yeah, way backward.
Right, to a sociologist who somehow managed to predict our exact current reality decades before the internet was even like a blueprint in a lab.
You're talking about Erving Goffman.
Exactly.
So to understand the silent architecture of the curated self, we have to start with Goffman. In 1959, he published this seminal work called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life.
1959, that's what, 50 years before the iPhone?
Yeah, basically. And his core thesis was that all human interaction functions like a theatrical performance. He divided our existence into two distinct spatial regions.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, you have the front stage. This is the realm where your behavior is meticulously tailored for an audience.
Where you manage impressions.
Right. It's where you conform to societal expectations.
Yeah.
You put on the mask.
So, the front stage is the job interview. It's that awkward first date where you pretend you love, independent foreign films.
Yes, exactly.
It's the moment you walk into a dinner party and scan the room to figure out what version of yourself you need to project.
And crucially, Goffman argued that human sanity actually relies on the existence of the other region, the backstage.
A private sphere.
Exactly. The backstage is the kitchen after the dinner party guests have left. It's where you kick off your shoes, drop the social mask, stop managing impressions entirely, and just exist.
In your imperfect, unvarnished authenticity.
Right. And the profound shift of our modern era, and really the root of our current psychological crisis, is the complete and total collapse of the boundaries between those two stages.
Because the smartphone obliterated the backstage.
Completely obliterated it. It demands a continuous, exhaustive, 24/7 front stage performance from everyday people.
I was reading through these sources, and the analogy that kept popping into my head to explain this collapse was the concept of a greatest hits album.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. If you look at how we operate online, the curated self is essentially an individual taking the messy, chaotic album of their entire life and aggressively stripping away all the B-sides.
All the filler.
Yeah, you digitally erase the awkward transitions, the glaring flaws, the professional failures.
Even just the mundane, boring context of a random Tuesday afternoon.
Exactly. And you're left with this highly synthesized static brand, a perpetual highlight reel. But let me ask you this, looking at human history, is this curatorial impulse really a modern crisis?
How do you mean?
Well, haven't human beings always tried to put their best foot forward? I mean, isn't wearing your Sunday best just a natural part of being a social creature?
It's a fair question, but the analysis in our sources elevates this far beyond just dressing nicely for a crowd. Existential philosophy actually characterizes this specific modern condition as bad faith.
Bad faith.
Yeah. It isn't just about putting your best foot forward. It's existing in a state where a living, breathing, dynamic human being treats themselves as a static, fixed object for public consumption.
Oh, wow. So you freeze yourself.
Essentially, when you constantly brand yourself for a digital audience, you actively alienate yourself from your own humanity.
Because you stop being a person who experiences the world.
And you start being a product that the world experiences.
You commodify your own existence.
Exactly. You turn yourself into a manageable asset.
That's terrifying. And the psychological frameworks in our research actually break down the precise mechanics of how damaging this is to the human brain, right?
They do. The sources highlight this specific framework called the multi-layered digital identity negotiation model.
The MDIM.
Right, the MDINM. It synthesizes three distinct psychological theories to map out the anatomy of the curated self.
I really want to spend some time on these three theories, Marcia McAdams and Inayatullah, because this is where the psychology gets incredibly sharp.
Yeah.
Let's start with Marcia's identity status theory.
Okay, so Marcia focuses heavily on the psychological friction between exploring who you are and actually committing to an identity.
Right. And the sources point out that in virtual spaces, especially for teenagers, these platforms function as identity playgrounds.
Identity playgrounds. That tension is the absolute core of Marcia's theory. Imagine a teenager entering a digital space.
Right.
They use different platforms to test out various personas. They adopt a certain aesthetic, express specific opinions, project a lifestyle.
And they get immediate feedback.
Right, quantifiable feedback via likes and comments. They're exploring. But the psychological friction arises because a healthy human psyche needs room to explore without the pressure of permanent commitment.
But the internet doesn't let you do that.
No, the digital platform fundamentally demands a fixed brand. The algorithm wants to know exactly what box to put you in.
So it can serve you the right ads.
Exactly, and recommend your content to the right people.
So you have a fluid human being trapped in a digital architecture that demands rigidity, which honestly flows perfectly into the second theory.
Yeah.
McAdams' narrative identity framework.
McAdams is fascinating here. He looks at how users construct highly idiosyncratic visual and textual narratives to imbue their digital lives with meaning.
So it's not just posting a photo of your coffee.
No, it's actively writing a mythology of yourself in real time.
Yeah, you take a mundane trip to a coffee shop, you'll buy a specific filter, add caption about, like, the hustle or romanticizing your life.
And suddenly you're writing a fictional plotline to convince your audience and yourself that your life has a coherent trajectory.
It's exhausting. The McAdams framework really highlights the labor of being your own biographer every single day.
It's an incredible amount of work. And then we reach the deepest strata with Inayatullah's causal layered analysis.
This one blew my mind.
Yeah, Inayatullah unearths the deeper cultural and mythic forces silently shaping these online representations.
So a selfie isn't just a selfie.
Far from it. According to this analysis, when a person takes a heavily filtered selfie, it isn't just surface-level vanity. They are tapping into deep-seated ancient human desires for immortality.
For lasting significance.
Right, for a perfection that evades death and decay. But they're desperately trying to satisfy those mythic, infinite desires through the shallow, finite medium of digital aesthetics.
That is a staggering way to look at a selfie. It's literally an attempt to freeze time.
Yes, absolutely.
So what happens when you combine all three of these psychological layers? You've got an individual who is constantly exploring but forced to commit by the algorithm.
Right.
Who is exhausted from writing a real-time biography and who is driven by an underlying mythic terror of being insignificant.
And the inevitable result is a psychological breaking point. The sources detail the severe risks of living in these identity playgrounds.
A massive gap forms, right?
Yes, and an unbridgeable gap between the meticulously engineered online persona and the chaotic, messy offline reality. And when that gap becomes too wide, you experience what psychologists call identity diffusion.
Identity diffusion, meaning you literally lose the coherent core of who you actually are.
Exactly. You look in the mirror and you don't recognize the person staring back because you spent too much time looking at the avatar.
And paradoxically, the more diffused and confused a person gets about their true identity,
the more susceptible they become to internet addiction.
Right. They feel an internal emptiness, so they plunge back into the digital ecosystem.
Frantically seeking social validation, likes, retweets, views.
Just to temporarily soothe the confusion, it becomes this endless neurological feedback loop.
Completely. The digital persona makes you feel empty, so you spend more time managing that persona to try and feel full.
You're drinking salt water to cure your thirst.
That's a perfect analogy.
But, realizing we are addicted to the front stage really only solves half the mystery. Because we didn't build the stage.
Yeah, we didn't.
To understand why this exhaustion feels inescapable, we have to look at the silent architecture sitting underneath our screens.
Right. The transition from human psychology to the machinery itself is critical here.
Because this vulnerability is being actively exploited.
Yes. And accelerated by the algorithmic ecosystems we navigate every day. The infrastructure that enables and demands the curated self is not a neutral tool.
It's highly engineered.
Mathematically optimized.
Our sources bring up a really fascinating framework to evaluate this machinery, the FAI-CST.
The flourishing AI benchmark.
Right. It's designed to test frontier AI models against a Christian understanding of holistic human flourishing.
And what's fascinating here is the data point that jumped out.
The 31-point drop.
Exactly. Current leading AI systems demonstrate a massive 31-point drop, specifically in the faith and spirituality dimension compared to human baselines.
That's huge. And the researchers attribute this to something they call procedural secularism. Let's translate that. Procedural secularism. This isn't saying that the computer program has a personal vendetta against religion, right?
No, not at all.
It's saying that the procedure, the actual mathematical training of the AI, is designed to flatten everything out.
Right. The models lack any deep theological or cohesive moral reasoning because they are trained by humans to prioritize broad acceptability.
And safety constraints.
And above all, continuous user engagement.
Of course. Engagement is king.
Right. An AI model trained to maximize the time you spend on a platform cannot afford to challenge you with deep, uncomfortable moral truths.
It just operates on a procedural secularism that treats all human desires as equally valid inputs to be optimized.
Exactly. So the algorithm is optimizing for what keeps you scrolling, not what makes you a whole, healthy human being.
And this leads to a concept the sources identify as digital catechesis.
Digital catechesis. As large language models and complex algorithms increasingly mediate how we get our news, how we communicate.
They begin to function as systemic instruments of instruction. But let's pause on that word. Catechesis.
It's a heavy word.
It's a $10 word. It's usually associated with formal religious instruction, right? The systemic teaching of doctrines to shape a believer's worldview.
The term is used here very deliberately. Every time you scroll for 3 hours, the algorithm is conducting a subtle, invisible catechesis.
Wow.
It is actively shaping, ordering, and often malforming your moral reflexes toward a very specific worldview.
Secular autonomy.
Yes. By constantly serving you content that validates your pre-existing biases and caters to your immediate desires, the algorithm quietly disciplines you to believe that you are the absolute center of the universe.
And that ultimate reality is simply whatever garners the most engagement.
Or makes you feel the most vindicated.
Okay, I follow the logic of the algorithm shaping our thoughts. But let me push back on the physical implications of this.
Sure.
If algorithms are catechizing us toward this hyper-individualistic secular autonomy online, how does that actually affect the physical reality of the listener?
What do you mean?
I mean, the listener sitting in their car making dinner right now, we still have physical bodies. We still have to eat, sleep, and go to work. We aren't just floating brains in the digital ether.
Not yet, but the end destination of this algorithmic catechesis is a profound cultural drift toward a disembodiment.
Disembodiment.
Yes. The technology is subtly hostile to the physical body. Think about the basic function of digital avatars, or highly customized social media profiles, or the curated aesthetics of a video game character. These are early iterations of technologies that literally train users to exist detached from their physical forms.
I see. So the logic goes, if I can completely invent who I am online, my gender, my appearance, my background,
then your physical body is no longer the anchor of your identity.
my body is just the biological hardware sitting in the chair.
Exactly. While the real you is outperforming and living in the digital space.
And this psychological detachment lays the fertile cultural groundwork for transhumanist technologies.
Yes. We see companies developing neural interfaces like Neuralink, and the culture is increasingly receptive to it.
Why?
Because the relentless logic of the curated self has already catechized us to believe that identity is entirely malleable and subject solely to individual will.
So the physical body is increasingly viewed merely as customizable hardware.
It isn't seen as an essential God-given component of your humanity. It's treated like a meat suit.
A meat suit you can upgrade, alter, suppress, or eventually discard altogether.
Yeah.
It is so dark.
But you can see how this manifests in everyday life.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Through what I call the digital illusion of total availability.
Tell me more about that.
Think about your daily routine. You want pad thai from across town, a few taps, and it's at your door in 20 minutes.
Right.
You want to hear a highly obscure B-side track from a 1984 punk band. You summon it from the cloud on command.
Yeah.
You want to engage with a friend or block them from your life entirely. You do it with a swipe. Every single digital practice fosters this mindset of total godlike autonomy.
It creates an immersive environment that entirely divorces us from physical, creaturely limits.
You never have to wait. You never have to be inconvenienced.
It creates a powerful, intoxicating illusion of ultimate self-sufficiency.
But here's the catch that the sources brilliantly unpack. This illusion of total autonomy, this obsessive curation of a perfect, static self.
Yeah.
Reading through the classical theological texts provided, this sounds strikingly like a very, very old problem.
It really does.
It sounds like Silicon Valley didn't invent a new psychological disorder. They just built a highly efficient digital architecture for a classical spiritual disease.
That's perfectly stated. The theological diagnosis is where the sources provide the most profound clarity.
Let's dive into that.
If we examine the curated self through the lens of historical Reformed theology, we realize this isn't just a modern psychological quirk.
It isn't just a byproduct of Instagram or TikTok.
Exactly. It's an intensified, technologically amplified manifestation of classical sin patterns.
Specifically, the sources align the curated self with the doctrine of total depravity.
Total depravity,
Yeah.
yes.
That is another one of those massive, intimidating theological phrases.
It is, yeah.
And I think it's often misunderstood to mean that humans are as completely evil as they could possibly be.
Right, which isn't what it means.
Reading the context here, it seems to mean that the depravity or the fracture in human nature affects the totality of the person, mind, body, will, and emotions.
Exactly.
So how does that ancient doctrine map onto our internet behavior?
Well, traditional Reformed theology operates on the presupposition of a unified moral personality. Meaning you are fundamentally one person, organically integrated body and soul, and you are accountable to God and your community as that single, unified entity.
Okay, I track with that.
But the architecture of digital platforms violently opposes this unity. It thrives on and demands identity multiplicity.
I really want to spend some time on identity multiplicity, because I think everyone listening intuitively knows exactly what this feels like.
For sure. We live incredibly fragmented lives.
Right. You are one highly sanitized professional persona on LinkedIn.
Right.
You switch tabs and become a completely different, highly aesthetic, curated persona on Instagram.
And then maybe you open up Reddit under an anonymous burner account and act in ways you would never dream of acting in public.
Exactly. You fracture your personality into a dozen pieces to fit the algorithmic demands and social expectations of each specific room you walk into.
And this fragmentation enables something incredibly dangerous: technologically mediated moral disengagement.
That sounds ominous.
It is. When you fracture your identity, you create cognitive distance between your true self and your curated digital avatars.
So it becomes a sophisticated mechanism to evade moral responsibility.
Yes. You can convince yourself that the cruel, vitriolic comment you left on a stranger's post or the highly deceptive filtered image you uploaded wasn't really you.
It was just the avatar acting in the digital realm.
The unified moral personality is shattered, allowing the depravity to express itself without the friction of personal accountability.
It's impression management on steroids, but stripped of all physical consequences. You can be a monster online and still view yourself as a saint offline because you've drawn a line between the two.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this leads right into the concept the sources bring up from St. Augustine.
Right, he had this specific phrase,
Curvatus in se,
curvatus in se.
which translates to humanity curved inward upon itself. Augustine argued that the foundational root of all sin isn't just breaking rules.
It's an attempt at self-deification.
Exactly. It's the human desire to become the god of your own universe, entirely independent of the actual creator.
And in the digital sphere, this inward curvature becomes absolute.
Total.
Humanity curved inward upon itself. That paints such a vivid, almost claustrophobic picture. It's a state of reflective isolation.
It really is.
It instantly reminds me of the classical myth of Narcissus,
Oh, that's a perfect connection.
because we usually use narcissist today to just mean someone who is arrogant or vain. We picture Narcissus staring at his beautiful reflection in the pool of water. But the actual tragedy of the Narcissus myth isn't just vanity. It's that he was so absolutely captivated by his own engineered reflection that he rejected all external human connection.
He withered away.
Literally withered away and died by the water because he rejected the imago Dei, the image of God and the people around him, in order to worship an illusion of himself.
And we do this exact same thing.
Every single day. Every time we curve inward over our glowing screens, ignoring the physical people in the room to obsess over how our digital reflection is performing, We are playing out the tragedy of Narcissus.
The modern screen is the pool of water. And when you worship your own algorithmic reflection, your soul inevitably implodes under the weight of that isolation.
It's inevitable.
What is truly fascinating and deeply concerning is how this contradiction plays out even among communities that possess the theological vocabulary to know better.
Right, the sources highlight that profound sociological study.
Yes, the study of youth within the Presbyterian Church of East Africa, the PCEA.
I found the PCEA study incredibly revealing because it exposes the limits of intellectual knowledge.
It really does.
You have these young believers who formally, intellectually confess the pervasive nature of sin. They agree with the doctrine of total depravity on Sunday morning.
Yet, the researchers found that their daily digital practices exhibit profound moral passivity and intense performative identity construction.
They are building curated selves just like everyone else.
It reveals a complete structural disconnect between their formal theological confession and their daily digital liturgy.
What they say they believe intellectually is entirely overridden by the visceral, bodily habits they practice on their phones Monday through Saturday.
The algorithm disciples their hearts far more effectively than their theology textbooks discipled their minds.
Though, to be fair to the modern teenager, and the sources make sure to point this out, publicly curating an idealized version of one's faith isn't an entirely novel 21st century invention.
No, not at all. The researchers brought up the 19th century journals of Charlotte Fortin.
Right. People have long utilized written documentation to project a curated, socially acceptable version of their inner lives.
The baseline human impulse to hide our flaws and project our virtues is ancient.
But what the sources emphasize is the difference in scale and velocity.
Exactly. While the desire to curate isn't new, the systemic, global algorithmic reinforcement of today makes it uniquely inescapable and destructive.
Living in this constant state of curvatus in se, constantly curving inward to monitor, adjust, and defend your personal brand across multiple platforms simultaneously requires an incalculable amount of psychological and spiritual energy.
Which naturally leads to a complete systemic depletion of the self.
And this endless performance brings us to the core symptom of the modern condition that the listener is likely feeling right now.
The sheer crushing exhaustion of validation. Exhaustion is the precise clinical reality. The psychological drive to maintain the curated self is intimately linked to a reliance on performance-based validation.
Because late modern society hands us a specific set of tools to build our identities.
The sources categorize these as false identity markers.
Let's break down those markers, because these are the dominant cultural mantras that society uses to tell us who we are.
Okay, go ahead.
The first mantra is, you are your work. This defines your human worth strictly through your professional output, your job title, and your economic success.
The hustle culture.
Exactly. The second mantra is, you are your history. This locates your identity in your sociological pedigree, your family background, your community entitlement, or even your past traumas.
Right.
And the third mantra is, you are your sexuality, which defines your ultimate identity through your internal passions and desires.
And the fatal flaw of these mantras is that they function as demanding idols.
Demanding idol.
Yes. Human beings are created with an infinite void in their hearts, a need for absolute, unconditional significance.
But these markers are finite.
Exactly. When you attempt to fill an infinite identity void with finite, fragile avenues like a corporate job title, a sociological marker, or shifting internal desires, you inevitably become enslaved to them.
They promise freedom, but they deliver exhaustion.
These self-made identities promise absolute validation, but what they actually require is continuous, draining performance. You have to keep succeeding at work. You have to keep perfectly performing your sociological role.
They are cruel masters because they never deliver the lasting peace they advertise.
Right.
But wait, let me jump in here and push back a little bit.
Sure.
Because if I look at modern psychology or just scroll through popular mental health advice online, the supposed cure for this anxiety is self-validation.
Oh, right.
I see it everywhere. I don't need your likes. I don't need society's approval. I just need to learn to love myself.
The self-love movement.
Right. If I can just validate myself, I'm free from the performance. But honestly, reading through the theological critique in these sources, self-validation sounds like trying to pull yourself out of quicksand by pulling up on your own hair.
That's a brilliant image.
It violates the laws of physics.
Yeah.
It logically cannot work.
You're absolutely right. Because self-validation fundamentally lacks an objective external anchor.
It's just you.
The sources are highly critical of this secular remedy because it demands that the isolated ego act as its own savior.
Which is an insane amount of pressure.
Think about the structural logic. If the core problem is that you are utterly exhausted from the labor of managing your own image and judging your own worth,
Yeah.
telling you that you must now be the sole absolute source of your own validation is just stacking more weight onto the exact same broken system.
It painfully reinforces the exact curvatus insen, that inward curvature that caused your anxiety in the first place.
Exactly. You are still trapped inside yourself, locked in a room with your own insecurities, desperately trying to manufacture a psychological justification for your own existence.
So if relying on human validation is exhausting, constantly chasing the likes, the promotions, the approval of the crowd, and relying on self-validation is a logical dead end, a psychological quicksand, the listener is basically trapped in a cycle of self-sabotage.
They are.
The system cannot fix itself from within. There has to be a radical external interruption to this cycle.
And that realization that the human system is incapable of generating its own cure leads directly to the theological resolution presented in our sources.
The concept of the vulnerable Christ.
Right.
I want to dive deep into the language the sources use regarding the vulnerable Christ because it is incredibly striking. The key concept introduced here is kenosis.
Kenosis is a Greek theological term that means total self-emptying.
Total self-emptying.
If the modern disease of the curated self is driven by idolatrous self-alienation and the frantic hoarding of reputation, the cure has to address that internal fragmentation.
And the historical cure offered in Christian theology is the incarnation and the crucifixion of Christ.
Right.
The sources outline a profound, almost jarring salvific paradox here.
Let's hear it.
Think about our digital lives. We spend all our energy, our money, and our time trying to project beauty, strength, and flawless perfection online.
Always armored up.
But the cross presents the exact opposite paradigm. It posits that Christ's physical deformity, his public humiliation, his brokenness, and his absolute suffering on the cross somehow become the very mechanism that restores form, beauty, and wholeness to humanity.
It is the ultimate cosmic inversion of the curated self.
The ultimate inversion.
The curated persona is heavily armored. It's obsessed with projecting invulnerability and hiding weakness. But the theology of the cross operates on a completely antithetical logic.
True strength is made perfect in absolute weakness.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources argue that the act of authentic confession, actually admitting your glaring flaws, your sins, and your brokenness to God and to others, actively dismantles the curated persona.
It takes a hammer to it.
By embracing vulnerability, the believer actually participates in Christ's kenosis. You are literally emptying yourself of the performative self.
You are unclasping and taking off the heavy, suffocating armor of impression management.
And the moment you take off that armor, a profound ontological shift occurs.
You transition from the isolated me to the corporate we.
The corporate we.
The sources bring in Augustinian thought regarding the Christus totus, which translates to the whole Christ.
The whole Christ.
True human fulfillment shifts the believer from being an isolated digital monad frantically trying to build a solitary brand into becoming a grafted, living member of an organic corporate body.
You are no longer standing alone on the front stage, sweating under the spotlight, desperately trying to remember your lines. You belong to a body.
Yes.
And that shift from the exhausting isolation of the me to the secure belonging of the we is rooted in a specific historical and theological concept of healing.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of what the sources call the gospel cure.
The gospel cure. I found the history of this term completely surprising.
It has a fascinating and highly relevant historical pedigree.
Yeah, the term was widely used in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by advocates like Frances Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They deployed the term gospel cure specifically as a counter-argument to secular medical models when treating inebriety or severe alcoholism.
And their argument was that sheer human willpower was insufficient to cure a deep-seated systemic addiction. It required a total spiritual replacement.
A replacement, right?
The philosophical premise behind that historical movement was articulated by the theologian Horace Bushnell as the expulsive power of a new affection.
The expulsive power of a new affection. That is such a beautiful phrase.
The underlying idea is that human beings are fundamentally driven by love and desire. You cannot simply instruct a human heart to stop loving a destructive habit.
Just saying no doesn't work.
Right. The void must be filled. The heart must be captured by a greater, more beautiful love.
And when the profound, overwhelming love of God takes up residence at the center of a person's identity, it naturally and organically expels the destructive habits from the inside out. So, translating that to our modern context, the expulsive power of a new affection is what forces out the addiction to digital curation. You stop obsessing over your digital reflection because your gaze has been captured by something infinitely more beautiful.
That's the cure.
But what is the actual structural mechanism of this cure?
The core mechanism is anchored in the final word of Jesus Christ on the cross, translated from the Greek, Tetelestai.
It is finished.
And the sources emphasize the ontological devastation of that single word upon the architecture of the curated self.
Okay, let's translate ontological devastation, because that is a massive phrase.
It is.
Ontology is just a philosophical term for the nature of your actual existence, the reality of being. So when we say Tetelestai causes ontological devastation, we mean it drops a nuclear bomb on the very foundation of how you justify your existence.
Yes.
Think about the premise of your digital identity. It is perpetually inherently unfinished. It always needs new content, fresh validation, continuous reputation management.
You are running on an endless, exhausting treadmill of self-justification.
You are never done being you online.
But Tetelestai abruptly and violently halts that treadmill. It is the ultimate log-off.
The ultimate log-off.
It declares, objectively and historically, that the cosmic mission of establishing your human worth has been completed once and for all by a divine substitute.
Wait. Let me play devil's advocate here.
Go for it.
If we're saying the work is truly finished, that my identity and worth are totally completed by a divine substitute, and I literally cannot add to my own value, doesn't that just breed absolute apathy?
I see what you're saying.
If my standing is entirely received rather than achieved, if I don't have to earn my spot, why would I ever get out of bed in the morning? Why try to be a good person or work hard or contribute to society?
It is the most common and classic objection to grace, but it fundamentally misunderstands the theological doctrine of union with Christ. Drawing on texts like 2 Corinthians 5.17, which speaks of the believer being a new creation, the sources highlighting classical theologians like Charles Spurgeon and Sinclair Ferguson explain that attempting to supplement Christ's finished work with your own human performance is actually the ultimate folly.
Because it destroys the very nature of grace.
Exactly. Because if you feel the need to add to it, it implies Christ didn't actually finish it.
Wow, right.
True, healthy, sustainable motivation doesn't come from fear. It comes from a posture of having already been accepted.
Having already been accepted.
Right. When you work tirelessly to earn acceptance, whether from God, your boss, or your followers, you are ultimately driven by anxiety, insecurity, and the terrifying fear of failure.
But when you are united with Christ, your legal and existential standing before the Creator of the universe is utterly, eternally secure.
Therefore, you obey, you work, and you serve others not to painfully build your identity, but out of profound, overflowing gratitude because your identity is already invincible.
You work from a place of rest, not for a place of rest. That is a massive paradigm shift.
And this touches on a massive historical debate in Protestant theology regarding the concept of assurance.
Assurance?
Yeah.
Like, how do you actually know you are secure?
Exactly. How do you feel it? John Calvin focused heavily on the inner testimony of the Holy Spirit to give a believer subjective comfort.
Looking inward.
Right. But Martin Luther insisted that looking continuously inward is highly dangerous, precisely because our human feelings and emotions violently fluctuate.
So Luther said what?
Luther argued we must look entirely without. We must anchor our assurance to the objective historical reality of Christ's finished work outside of ourselves.
Anchor outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
The sources also brought in a fantastic perspective from Pope John Paul II on this issue.
Oh, yes.
He spoke about the concept of Eucharistic identity, noting that true human happiness is ultimately found in self-giving, not self-curation. When you know deep in your bones that you are totally and unconditionally accepted, you are finally free to actually give yourself away in love to your family, your community, and your work without constantly obsessing over how that self-giving affects your personal brand.
The absolute security of the gospel destroys the anxiety of the digital front stage. You don't need to perform when you know you are unconditionally loved behind the curtain.
But let's look at the practical friction of this.
The daily reality.
Exactly. Intellectually agreeing with Tetelestai, nodding your head and saying, yes, my worth is secure in Christ is one thing.
But living that out on a Tuesday afternoon is entirely different.
Right. Sitting at a desk in a world that is literally engineered by supercomputers to harvest your attention and make you feel deeply inadequate. How does the listener practically resist that machinery?
If the algorithm is constantly discipling us, we need counter-liturgies.
Yes, counter-liturgies. This is where the profound theology must become intensely physically practical.
The sources point us to the philosophical theology of James K.A. Smith. Smith argues that the digital web is not just a neutral tool that we objectively pick up and put down.
It is an immersive, highly charged liturgical space.
Exactly. Meaning the internet is essentially functioning as a secular cathedral.
It trains us.
It conducts formative practices on our bodies and minds every single day.
The swiping, the endless scrolling, the push notifications.
Those are not just actions. They are secular digital liturgies. They recalibrate our visceral gut-level desires. They subconsciously discipline us through repetition to worship the created self rather than the creator.
The cultural critic, Alan Noble's critique of autonomy, fits perfectly into this framework.
It really does.
Noble points out that the crushing burden of modern life is this deeply held, unquestioned cultural belief that we belong entirely to ourselves, that we are our own ultimate authority.
And therefore, our own ultimate responsibility.
Right. If your life fails, if you aren't happy, if your brand tanks, it is 100% on you.
It is an unbearable weight.
But the sources contrast this modern, exhausting illusion of autonomy with the very first question of the historic Heidelberg Catechism,
Which offers perhaps the most liberating truth ever written.
I am not my own, but belong body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ.
Knowing fundamentally that you are not your own property immediately relieves the unbearable burden of identity management.
You don't have to manage what doesn't belong to you.
This raises an urgent practical question.
Okay.
How do the church and the individual listener actually implement embodied physical practices to actively resist the digital liturgy? Because mere intellectual realization isn't enough to fight an algorithm.
We need physical, bodily counter-liturgies. The sources outline some very specific, grounded steps for the listener to start implementing today. Let's start with the most foundational and arguably the most difficult one in the modern era.
Sabbath rest.
Sabbath rest.
In a global culture that fundamentally demands 24/7 availability and relentless output, taking a biblical Sabbath is an act of radical anti-cultural rebellion.
It's the intentional physical ceasing of production, consumption, and self-curation.
To bodily declare your trust in the finished work of Christ.
It's the feeling you get when your phone battery dies and you realize you don't have a charger for the next 3 hours.
The initial panic.
Right. Initially, there's a spike of sheer panic, but eventually, there's this profound wave of relief. The world will actually keep spinning if you stop posting.
Scheduling actual soul rest, intentional, guarded time physically away from glowing rectangles is the only way to reorient the human mind away from the relentless anxiety of the front stage.
Okay, what's the next practical step?
Trading highlight reels for honesty.
We talked extensively about dismantling the curated persona. Practically, in daily life, this means intentionally sharing your bloopers.
Yes, it means engaging in the gritty, unglamorous, often awkward work of confession and asking for forgiveness with physical human beings in your life.
When you let go of hidden bitterness, admit you were wrong, and ask for forgiveness, you're actively unbuckling and removing the performative armor.
You cannot have authentic, life-giving fellowship with another human being while wearing heavily polished PR armor.
It's impossible. Intimacy requires vulnerability.
Absolutely.
But as we look at these practices, we also have to address the ecclesiological implications. Because it isn't just individual teenagers or professionals who fall into the trap of the curated self. Entire churches and religious institutions do this all the time.
Oh, heavily. The temptation for pastoral and institutional leadership to adopt the secular mechanics of the curated self is immense.
The sources explicitly identify pragmatism as a deeply embedded church killer.
Pragmatism.
Meaning the philosophy of whatever gets the most physical bodies in the realm or the most views on our live stream is inherently what we should do.
Exactly. It replaces the slow, often hidden, prayerful pursuit of divine guidance with slick marketing metrics and expert-driven corporate growth models.
It carefully curates a successful, shiny, highly produced public image of the church.
While the actual substantive spiritual vitality of the congregation rots away underneath the surface.
The sources contrast this heavily with the presentation of Christ in Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus is established as the sole authoritative teacher.
The underlying point is that you don't need a viral marketing gimmick or a highly curated brand aesthetic when you possess the reality of a resurrected king.
And this connects directly to the theologian Timothy Keller's paradigm of the center church.
Keller argued that believers in churches must intentionally live their faith publicly through acts of genuine shalom.
Shalom, a Hebrew concept meaning deep peace, holistic wholeness, and flourishing for the entire surrounding community.
The church shouldn't retreat into a heavily curated, defensive, civic private sphere, nor should it engage in the simplistic, retributive theology that often dominates digital discourse.
The sources mention the notoriously bad theology of Job's friends in the Old Testament here, which is a brilliant connection.
It really is. Job's friends essentially operated on a primitive karmic algorithm. If you are suffering, it must be because your moral performance was bad.
And if you're prospering, it must be because you curated your life well and God is rewarding you.
That is terrible, destructive theology. The modern church must instead embody the kenosis of the vulnerable Christ.
It must function as a physical sanctuary where individuals are absolutely not measured by their economic performance, their political utility, or their digital aesthetic,
but are actively invited to drop the heavy mask and rest fully in the finished work of the Savior.
And as we synthesize all these practical steps, fighting for Sabbath rest, embracing vulnerability, rejecting institutional pragmatism, it becomes abundantly clear that moving from an exhausted, curated life to an authentic, grounded one isn't a one-time intellectual decision.
No, it's an ongoing daily conversion.
It's a daily physical battle to log off the front stage, step away from the vanity of the mirror, and trust the messy B-sides of your life to grace.
It is the deeply physical daily practice of remembering that you are already entirely known and already entirely loved.
So what does this all mean for you? We've covered a massive, dense landscape of information today.
We really have.
We started with Irving Goffman's exhausting concept of the front stage, exploring how we are all currently trapped playing frantic PR managers for our own lives.
We looked under the hood at the terrifying algorithmic machinery.
The procedural secularism that is actively, silently catechizing us toward disembodiment and the crushing illusion of absolute autonomy.
We diagnose the underlying disease through Augustine's curvatus and say, the tragedy of a humanity curved entirely inward, staring at our own engineered reflections until our souls literally implode from the isolation.
And finally, we explored the radical, liberating reality of the gospel, cure the kenosis of the vulnerable Christ, and the profound ontological devastation of Tetelestai. It is finished.
I want to say this directly to you, the listener, right now. You do not have to be your own PR manager anymore.
You don't.
You do not have to carry the unbearable, crushing weight of continuous self-creation. The ultimate validation of your existence has already been securely, permanently, and externally verified.
You have permission to step off the stage.
Absolutely.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
What is it?
If the ultimate historical cure to our deep spiritual exhaustion is learning to rest deeply in a finished work, how does this radically reshape how we approach the beginning of things? Think about the next generation. We are currently raising children who will never ever know what a pre-digital world felt like.
Never.
If the engagement algorithm is already their primary baseline liturgy, training their desires before they can even speak, how do we practically teach them how to rest securely in their inherent worth long before they ever learn how to perform for the digital crowd?
That is undoubtedly the greatest generational challenge of our time.
Something to seriously think about the next time you instinctively reach into your pocket for your phone. Step off the stage, leave the heavy armor behind, and enjoy the rest. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.